The master smith breaks open the clay furnace after 3 days and nights of constant fire. The walls collapse inward, brittle from heat and exhaustion. Steam erupts as cold air strikes metal that has not cooled since it was born. What lies inside is not a clean ingot, not a smooth, obedient block of steel. It is rough, fractured, half buried in ash. Akira, a single fused bloom of iron and steel, riddled with contradiction. High-carbon steel clings to low-carbon iron. Hardness and softness exist side by side. Some sections will take an edge sharp enough to shave hair. Others will bend, tear, or crumble under the hammer. Nothing about it is uniform. Nothing about it is predictable. The smith does not curse this. He does not sigh or turn away. He expected it. Because in medieval Japan, perfection was never the goal. Adaptation was. When people imagine the katana, they usually reach for myth. A blade folded 1,000 times, a sword that can cut through anything, forged by masters who somehow transcended the physical limits of steel itself. That version is seductive. It feels ancient. It feels mystical. It feels inevitable. But it is not true. The katana was not born from magic or lost secrets. It was engineered, a practical response to constraint, to poor raw materials, to inconsistent steel, to specific armor, terrain, and a society that tightly controlled weapons and the people allowed to carry them. Japanese smiths did not chase ideal steel. They learned how to survive without it. Welcome to Japan Rewind. This is where we strip away the myths and look at how Japan actually solved impossible problems. Japan's sword story begins with a problem that could not be ignored. Unlike many regions of continental Eurasia, Japan lacked large deposits of easily mined iron ore. Instead, iron came as sand, satetsu, washed down from eroding mountains into rivers and coastal plains. Every batch was different. Carbon content varied, impurities varied. Even how the steel behaved under heat could change from one load to the next. Early iron production everywhere involved uncertainty, but iron sand magnified the problem. There was no seam to rely on, no predictable source to standardize around, no way to refine away inconsistency at scale. Japanese smiths had to assume variability as a permanent condition, so they stopped fighting it. The tatara furnace reflects this acceptance, a low clay structure built for a single run and destroyed at the end. Fed continuously with charcoal and iron sand for days. Crews worked in exhausting shifts, adjusting airflow and temperature by sound, flame color, and long experience rather than instruments. They listened to the furnace. They watched it. They learned its moods. Nothing about the process guaranteed the same result twice. When the furnace was finally broken open, the outcome was always uneven. From enormous amounts of raw material, only a portion emerged as high-quality tamahagan, suitable for blades. Other grades were carefully sorted for tools, fittings, and agricultural implements. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was expected to be perfect. The achievement was not flawless steel. It was learning how to control chaos. This is where one of the most persistent katana myths begins to collapse. The idea of a blade folded 1,000 times sounds impressive, until you understand what folding actually does. Each fold doubles the number of layers. Fold once, and you have 2. Fold again, and you have 4. By 10 folds, you already exceed 1,000. By 15, you are deep into the tens of thousands. Historical blades were not folded endlessly. They did not need to be. Most evidence points to roughly 8 to 16 folds. enough to stretch out slag inclusions, enough to distribute carbon more evenly, enough to weld inconsistent material into something reliable. Beyond that point, folding becomes destructive. Carbon equalizes too much. The steel loses the internal contrast that gives it strength, resilience, and shock resistance. Folding was not ritual. It was damage control. The surface patterns later admired as harder were not aesthetic goals at first. They were fingerprints of necessity, visible proof that the steel began uneven and survived refinement. But even folded steel was not enough. The tatara did not produce large quantities of high-carbon steel. So Japanese smiths made a decision that reshaped sword design entirely. They stopped trying to make the whole blade from the best material. Instead, they used it only where it mattered. Composite construction became standard practice, a hard steel edge supported by softer, tougher iron. Different zones within the blade, each serving a specific purpose. This was not compromise, it was optimization. Scarce, brittle steel went where cutting happened. Tougher material went where shock was absorbed. The blade became a system rather than a single object. Swordmaking did not exist in isolation. It operated inside a tightly regulated social order where weapons were symbols of permission as much as tools of violence. Only certain people were allowed to carry swords. Only certain workshops were allowed to produce them. Lineages formed not just around skill, but around trust. Knowledge was not written down in manuals. It was embodied through repetition. Judgments about heat, timing, and risk could not be standardized. They had to be learned slowly, through failure. And failure was common. Blades cracked, edges warped, weeks of labor ended as scrap. But failure was not wasted effort. A blade that survived folding, construction, and hardening had already proven something before it ever reached a battlefield. It had survived risk. Over time, this shaped how swords were understood, not as interchangeable weapons, but as individual objects with limits, temperaments, and histories. A sword that cut well was valued. A sword that survived abuse was respected. Then came the most dangerous step of all, differential hardening. Once the blade was shaped, the smith coated it in clay, thick along the spine, thin near the edge. This was not decoration. It was thermal engineering. The blade was heated until the steel reached the point where its internal structure could change, judged by color and experience alone. Then it was plunged into water. The exposed edge cooled almost instantly, transforming into extremely hard martensite. The clay-insulated spine cooled more slowly, becoming tougher and more flexible. If everything went right, water quenching a long blade is unforgiving. Too hot and it cracks. Too cool and it fails to harden. Uneven clay and the blade warps beyond correction. Many blades never survived this moment. Historical accounts and modern recreations both confirm high rejection rates. Days or weeks of work could be lost in seconds. The hamon, the visible boundary between hard and soft, is the scar left by that risk. Later generations elevated it into art, but its origin lies in survival. This was a blade designed to cut brutally, yet endure failure. That design only makes sense when placed back into its real environment. Despite popular imagery, swords were not the primary weapons of medieval Japanese warfare. Bows dominated at distance. Spears and polearms controlled the battlefield. Swords were sidearms, drawn when formations broke, when distance closed, when chaos replaced order. The katana's curved, single-edged geometry excelled at draw cutting. The edge stayed engage through the strike. Against flesh, bone, and lightly protected targets, it was devastating. But it was never meant to cleave through armor. Samurai armor, lamella, scale, and later reinforced plate was designed specifically to defeat cuts. Swords targeted gaps, joints, hands, necks. Precision mattered more than force. Japan's environment reinforced this reality. Humidity accelerated corrosion. Rain and mud punished delicate thrusting weapons. Dense terrain and confined spaces reduced the usefulness of long, rigid blades. As warfare evolved, especially during the Sengoku period, combat moved closer. Castles, streets, interiors, sword forms adapted gradually. Longer tachi and shorter katana coexisted for generations, reflecting changing contexts rather than sudden replacement. Carried edge up, the katana favored faster drawing and better control in tight spaces. Still, it remained secondary. Firearms, logistics, and numbers ended wars. Swords ended moments, which makes the remaining myths easier to dismantle. A katana cannot cut through anything. No sword can. Solid metal defeats edge weapons. Armor exists precisely to absorb or deflect force. The katana is not universally superior. European longswords optimized for thrusting into plate gaps. Chinese blades balanced cutting and thrust across different doctrines. Persian sabers maximized mounted cutting. Each represents a solution to a specific problem. And while ritual and belief surrounded Japanese swordmaking, the defining features of the katana are intelligible without invoking mysticism. Iron sand, batch inconsistency, resource scarcity, regulation, transmission of hard-won technique. By the early modern period, stability transformed the sword again. Under Tokugawa rule, mass warfare declined. The blade shifted from battlefield tool to regulated symbol. Craftsmanship intensified. Aesthetics deepened. The sword did not change because people imagined it differently. It changed because the world demanded something else. In the end, the katana is remarkable, not because it defied limitation, but because it embraced it. Poor ore became composite design. Inconsistent steel became differential hardening. Risk became refinement. Japan created a sword unlike any other because it had no choice. And in that constraint, it found innovation. If you want to explore how limitation shaped other parts of Japanese history, from warfare to architecture to daily survival, subscribe to Japan Rewind. Leave a comment with the topic you want next. And ring the bell. We will keep pulling apart the myths and showing what really made Japan's past endure.